Before the Cotopaxi became a ghost story, before its name was swallowed by the legend of the Bermuda Triangle, before newspapers transformed it into a maritime riddle, there was a man, a real man, standing on the deck holding the weight of a ship that would one day vanish without a trace. His name was Captain W.J. Meyer, a man of the sea, a man of routine, a man built not from myth, but from decades of salt, storms, sweat, and discipline. And yet, today, his name floats somewhere between history and speculation, suspended in a twilight where fact and theory blur. This documentary begins not with the disappearance, nor with the SOS call, nor with the discovery of the wreckage nearly a century later. No, it begins with the captain himself, because to understand the mystery, you must first understand the man who carried it. In the early 1900s, men like W.J. Meyer belonged to a generation defined not by comfort or predictability, but by endurance. They lived in an age when ships creaked, engines groaned, hulls rusted quickly, and voyages were measured not by convenience but by survival. Meyer was no exception. He earned his stripes the hard way, climbing the ranks through storms and sleepless nights, long before modern navigation, whether satellites or automated systems, could assist him. Everything he knew, he learned through intuition, experience, scars, and the silent language of the sea. He was respected, not adored, not feared, respected, and for a captain that is far more valuable. But respect does not protect a man from fate. Little was ever recorded about Meyer's personal life. There are no interviews, diaries, radio recordings, or official speeches. No letters survived. No written confessions of fear, doubt, or hope. And this absence creates the first layer of mystery. How do you understand a man who left no words behind? The only pieces of Meyer that remain are scattered crew accounts from earlier voyages, naval employment records, statements from fellow mariners, fragments of the company's archives, and, of course, the tragedy itself. What these fragments reveal is a portrait of a man carved by discipline, a man who did not indulge in drama, a man who knew his role and embodied it with quiet resolve. Above all, they reveal a man who took command seriously, even when the ship he commanded, the Cotopaxi, was far from deserving his dedication. When the Clinchfield Navigation Company assigned Meyer to the SS Cotopaxi in late 1925, they handed him a responsibility wrapped in rust. The Cotopaxi was old, aged by years of heavy coal routes, scarred from previous voyages, and weakened structurally, though the true extent of its vulnerabilities remained hidden beneath layers of corporate optimism and worn paint. Crew members later recalled that some areas of the ship moaned even in calm waters, as though protesting every mile. One theory suggests that Meyer knew the Cotopaxi was not in ideal condition. But captains of that era were accustomed to imperfect vessels. They had no luxury to demand perfection. They sailed with what they were given. But there was one detail that would later become central to the tragedy. The hatch covers, the ones meant to keep seawater out, were allegedly in deplorable condition. Whether this is fact or theory depends on the source, but the implications are massive. If the hatches were weak, then the Cotopaxi wasn't just a ship. It was a trap waiting to be triggered by the ocean, and Meyer walked into that trap with the same sense of duty he carried his entire life. In Charleston, South Carolina, under a sky indifferent to human fate, the Cotopaxi prepared for departure. The cargo, 2,340 tons of coal, dense, heavy, unforgiving. The destination, Havana, Cuba. The atmospheric routine, but tense. Some crew members reportedly expressed concern. Storm systems were forming in the Atlantic. Winds were shifting, but schedules were schedules, and shipping companies did not yield to weather forecasts as modern logistics do. And so the captain gave the order to depart. Some say Meyer paused on the deck for a moment before boarding, as if sensing something looming beyond the horizon. This is theory, but a theory that has fueled countless retellings. He stepped aboard. He took command. He sailed. No one on that deck could have imagined that this would be the beginning of the end for the ship, for the crew, and for the captain whose name was destined to live in both history and mystery. What separates Meyer from other captains lost to history is the silence around him. Most tragedies leave behind words, testimonies, logs, letters. But in Meyer's case, everything vanished with him. This has created a psychological canvas for theories. Some believe he was stern and unshakable. Some argue he carried secret doubts about the ship. Some imagine him as a man torn between obedience and instinct. Some picture him as a captain trying desperately to remain rational as the storm closed in. But there is one theory that stands above the rest. Meyer was calm, not because he lacked fear, but because fear is a luxury a captain cannot afford. The man who steers a ship must appear unbreakable, even when the ship is breaking beneath him. Hours into the voyage, the Cotopaxi faced rising winds. Rain struck the deck with the sharpness of gravel. Waves began to grow, one after another, stacking like dark mountains. For the crew, it was a storm. For Meyer, it was a calculation. How much could the ship endure? How much could the hatches hold? How fast could the pumps work? How far was the nearest safe harbor? How long could he maintain control? These were not fears, these were equations. Equations he had solved dozens of times in his life. But this time, the variables were different. This time, the ship fighting beneath him was not the ship of his prime years. This time, the ocean had the advantage. A seasoned captain senses danger long before the crew does. He reads the angle of the deck, the groan of the hull, the vibration of the engine, the color of the waves, the sound of the wind, the rhythm of the rain, and most importantly, the behavior of the crew. A nervous crew is a warning. A silent crew is a worse warning, but a crew trusting the captain, that is the weight that breaks a man's heart when things go wrong. Theory suggests that Meyer felt that weight intensify as the storm grew. He had 32 men trusting him, men with families, dreams, fears, and he had to navigate not only the ocean, but the responsibility for every life aboard. As night fell, the Cotopaxi pressed deeper into the storm. Waves slammed the hull hard enough to vibrate the bones of every man aboard. The wind screamed like something alive. Lightning carved white scars across the sky. And still Meyer remained at his post. Hours before the SOS that would become his final transmission, it is theorized that the captain paced the deck, checking the conditions personally. Not because he doubted the crew, but because he doubted the ship. The man trusted people, but not steel. Steel rusts, steel lies, steel fails, and this steel was old. Meyer understood the stakes better than anyone. He had entered a battle with a sword that could break in his hands, and yet he fought. Some historians and psychologists suggest that Meyer experienced what mariners call the captain's premonition. It is not supernatural. It is instinct sharpened over decades. It is the moment when a captain senses the shift, the moment when the sea changes intention. Experienced mariners swear this feeling is real, and theory suggests Meyer felt it that night. Maybe it was the angle of the ship, maybe the smell of the storm, maybe the sound of water hitting metal from the wrong direction, but something intangible must have whispered to him, this storm is different, and that whisper was the first warning of the tragedy to come. The night deepened, the storm grew stronger. The waves rose like giants armed with black fists made of seawater and wind. The Cotopaxi pushed forward not out of strength, but out of inertia, and somewhere on that trembling deck, Captain W.J. Meyer felt the tightening grip of destiny. The theories about these final hours are among the most studied and debated in maritime history. Some say he remained composed. Some believe he fought panic internally. Others argue he tried to force the ship against the wind to reduce flooding. All agree on one thing: this was the beginning of the end. Sometime during the night of November 30th, theory suggests the first catastrophic sign appeared. Water in the lower cargo holds, not droplets, not seepage, not minor leaks, but intrusion. The unmistakable rush of seawater forcing itself through weakened hatch covers. Coal, when wet, becomes deadly. Its weight increases dramatically, shifting the balance of the ship and making pumps struggle. The crew may have heard the horrifying sound of water smashing into the hold, followed by the grinding of shifting coal. This moment is pivotal because it marks the transition from a severe storm to an existential threat, and Meyer would have known immediately what it meant if the water had reached the coal. The Cotopaxi's survival time was limited. The storm raged outside, but inside the ship another battle began. Theory suggests the crew rushed into action. Men operating hand pumps, others trying to reinforce failing hatches, others checking compartments, others trying to stabilize shifting cargo, but the Cotopaxi was old. Its bones were tired. Its joints had been tested too many times. Every effort by the crew was heroic, and, in hindsight, tragically insufficient. Meyer likely watched his men with a sinking heart. He saw their exhaustion, their fear, their determination, and he knew one thing they did not. Water wins, always, in the chaos of the storm. The bridge became the eye of not the storm but of responsibility. Theories describe Meyer standing there, soaked, gripping the rail, fighting the tilt of the deck, adjusting his stance instinctively with every violent pitch of the ship. The bridge is where a captain becomes both judge and prisoner of his own decisions. From there, he would have assessed the angle of roll, listened to the hull groaning, watched a compass spin under magnetic interference, read the waves like a language, chosen every maneuver with deadly seriousness. Unlike the crew, he could not simply fight. He had to think. Storms don't destroy captains. Decisions do. And Meyer had to decide whether the Cotopaxi could survive or whether he had to prepare for the unthinkable. Morning, or what passed for morning, under skies blackened by the storm. Winds reached levels documented in other ships' logs from the same period. Winds strong enough to snap masts, tear sails, and push steel hulls sideways. It is believed that the Cotopaxi began to list significantly at this time. The angle grew worse with every impact of the waves. Crew members would have clung to railings. Equipment slid across the deck. Barrels broke loose. And every crash inside the hold brought the same thought: how much more can the ship take? This was the moment the distress call became inevitable. The radio operator, whose name has been lost to history, was the only man on board with the power to speak beyond the storm. Theories recreate the scene. He braces himself against the desk. His fingers trembled not from fear, but from the violent shaking of the ship. Static crackles in the headphones. Lightning flashes through the porthole. The captain stands behind him, steadying himself with a hand on the bulkhead. And then the message is sent: Cotopaxi taking water, listing badly. There are multiple interpretations of the exact wording, but the meaning is always the same. We are sinking. That message is the last recorded action of the ship, the last moment the world heard from Meyer and his men, the last cry before silence. According to maritime psychologists, captains in extreme emergencies often experience a phenomenon called situational narrowing, where fear fades and the mind focuses intensely on essential tasks. Theory strongly supports that Meyer entered this state. Witness accounts from other ships in similar storms describe captains who spoke softly to keep crew calm, issued short, clear commands, avoided showing panic, ignored their own safety, prioritized every second of life they could preserve. If Meyer behaved like the captains of his generation, he would have acted the same, not because he wasn't afraid, but because fear wastes seconds, and seconds were a currency he could no longer afford. Every ship has a moment where it stops responding to the helm, a moment when it becomes dead weight in the water. Theories suggest that for the Cotopaxi this moment came shortly after the SOS perhaps. Water shifted the coal too far, the pumps failed entirely, the storm reached its peak intensity, or the structural failure progressed beyond recovery. Whatever the exact cause, one thing became clear: the Cotopaxi was no longer a ship, it was a sinking carcass. And with that realization, Meyer would have known the final battle had begun. Storms do not kill ships alone, they kill hope. Theories about these final minutes focus not on the technical, but the human. Some crew members may have prayed, others shouted at the wind, others clung to the railings, refusing to let go. A few may have tried to help others reach safety, even though deep down they all felt the truth. There was no safety left. And through all this, the captain stood with them. This is not myth, this is not legend, this is not supernatural. This is leadership, a kind of leadership forged in storms, seen only in moments where life becomes fragile enough to shatter. Among all theories, one stands above the rest. Meyer understood the Cotopaxi was going to sink long before the crew did. This doesn't make him responsible for the disaster. It makes him aware of the structural weaknesses, aware of the storm's intensity, aware of the physics of a flooded coal hold, aware of the mathematics of survival. A captain carries knowledge that the crew does not, and that knowledge is often unbearable. The theory suggests that Meyer spent his final hours balancing two truths. The ship may not survive, but the men need me to act like it will. That is the loneliness of command, a loneliness no theory can fully describe. After the SOS, the Cotopaxi fell silent. No more messages, no more signals, no more signs of life. What happened next is the core of part 3. The ship rolled, the coal shifted, the water surged, the hull buckled, the lights flickered, and men prepared for the worst without saying the words aloud. Theories reconstruct these minutes as the most terrifying of all. A ship twisting under the force of the sea, a captain issuing his final commands, a crew clinging to existence. The descent had begun, and in part 3, we follow them into the heart of the catastrophe. The distress signal had been sent. The ocean had answered not with mercy, but with force. The Cotopaxi was now a wounded giant, drifting, twisting, and groaning under the crushing weight of the storm. Inside, the men clung to the cold steel around them, fighting for balance, for breath, for hope. And above them all, standing where only captains stand in moments like these, was W.J. Meyer. After the last SOS message, everything changed. No more radio contact, no more desperate signals, no more human voices reaching the world beyond the storm. Only the sea remained powerful, relentless, unforgiving. Theories suggest that at this point the Cotopaxi had entered what naval engineers call terminal instability. This occurs when a ship has taken on too much water, has lost ballast stability, has cargo shifting uncontrollably, and can no longer correct its tilt. In simpler terms, the ship was dying, and the crew could feel the death throes. The listing of the Cotopaxi grew worse. 10 degrees, then 15, then 20. Theory suggests that by the time the angle reached 30 degrees, the men on deck were practically walking on walls. A ship at such an angle is no longer a ship, it's a trap sliding into the sea. Every loose object became a projectile. Barrels rolled with destructive force. Metal chains whipped across the deck. Water surged across the floor with the weight of a collapsing river. And amid the chaos, the captain's voice could be heard, short, sharp, commanding, trying to keep order while the ship he commanded twisted beneath his feet. The lower compartments became hell. Waves forced their way inside through the failing hatch covers. Slabs of coal shifted violently, crashing against steel walls like black avalanches. Men attempting to operate pumps were thrown off their feet by the tilt. Some theories suggest that a few crew members were likely trapped below deck as flooding accelerated. There is no romantic version of this part of the story. It is harsh, brutal, and tragically realistic. The ship was sinking from the inside first, and every man there knew it. At some catastrophic point during the storm, the Cotopaxi's engine stopped. Not slowed, not struggled. Stopped. The engine room would have exploded in noise. Steam bursts, metal cracking, alarms, shouting darkness. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. A dead engine in a storm means a dead ship. Theory suggests that when the engine went silent, Meyer experienced what mariners call the captain's heartbreak. It is the moment when he realizes he no longer commands the vessel. The sea does. As water infiltrated essential compartments, the electrical system failed. The Cotopaxi plunged into darkness. Imagine a crew scattered across a tilting deck. No lights, only lightning revealing brief flashes of chaos, wind screaming like a living creature, thunder rattling the metal skeleton of the ship, and the captain fighting to remain upright on a floor that was no longer horizontal. Darkness is more terrifying than the storm, because in darkness, imagination fills the void, and fear becomes a physical presence. Did Meyer try to abandon ship? All theories say no. Not because he didn't want to live, but because there was no time, no stability, no clear angle to lower lifeboats, no chance that a small wooden craft could survive waves taller than buildings. Instead, it is believed he attempted a final maneuver, turning the bow into the waves to reduce the risk of capsizing. But with no engine, this was nearly impossible. The ship resisted, tilted further, and then, in one violent motion, the Cotopaxi began to roll. One of the most discussed theories among historians is that Meyer issued one last command: hold on to something, short, urgent, human. It is believed that in the final moments he tried to prevent panic, even when panic was the natural reaction. A captain's last order is never about saving himself. It's about giving his men the smallest chance of survival, even if that chance is nearly zero. The theory is heartbreaking and inspiring at the same time. When large ships capsize, it happens with horrifying speed. Experts describe the sequence as a violent list to port or starboard cargo shifting abruptly, structural supports failing internally, the ship rolling sideways, water pouring into every opening, men thrown across decks or into the sea, the vessel disappearing beneath the surface. The Cotopaxi likely rolled to the side where the flooding was heaviest. The tilt became impossible to stand on. Men lost balance instantly. Equipment slid like blades across the deck. Waves swallowed everything. And through all of it, the captain stood at his post. That is not theory. That is tradition. That is the code of the sea. In theory, Meyer's final second was not filled with heroism or speeches. It was filled with something far more meaningful: acceptance. Not of defeat, but of duty. He knew the ship could not be saved. He knew the men would not survive. He knew the ocean had claimed them, but he stayed, because captains do not abandon their ships. Not in 1925, not now, not ever. One theory describes his final moment like this: lightning illuminates the deck. Rain lashes his face. The ship rolls beneath him. He grips the rail one last time, and the sea rises to meet him, a man alone against eternity. After the Cotopaxi disappeared beneath the waves, the world searched for answers. None came. No wreckage, no survivors, no floating debris, no explanation, silence. And in that silence, Meyer's story began to drift away from reality and into myth. The Triangulo das Bermudas absorbed his name. Newspapers exaggerated the storm. Books invented supernatural angles. Theories multiplied, and the man became a legend. But legends are shadows. This documentary is about the man behind the shadow. Part 4 will explore the immediate aftermath. The frantic search, the media frenzy, the theories born from the silence, and how the world lost and distorted the captain's story. The sea had swallowed the Cotopaxi, the storm had ended, the ocean surface returned to its deceptive calm, and for the world outside, life continued. But underwater, in the darkness of the Atlantic, a chapter of history had closed. A ship was gone, a crew was gone, a captain was gone, and on the surface above, something even more devastating began. Silence, the kind of silence that erases names, the kind of silence that distorts truths, the kind of silence that opens the door to myths. Between 1925 and the early decades of the 20th century, the fate of the captain began to fade, not suddenly, but slowly, like ink dissolving in water. And this is where Part 4 begins. Not with the storm, not with the sinking, but with the world's reaction to the void left behind. In the days immediately after the disappearance, the company, the U.S. Coast Guard and maritime authorities initiated searches. Ships were dispatched, routes were inspected. Radio operators listened for faint signals. Fishing vessels scanned coastlines. Newspapers reported possible sightings, but everything ended the same way. Nothing. No debris, no lifeboat, no life jacket, no plank of wood, no piece of coal, no body, and this absence triggered something dangerous. A story without evidence becomes a story open to anyone's interpretation. While authorities abandoned the search, the families did not. Wives waited by windows that faced the sea. Mothers kept lamps lit through the night. Children asked when their fathers would return, and the silence grew heavier. In the early 20th century, grief was a different kind of suffering. There were no bodies to bury, no funerals, no official explanations. Just a telegram saying, "The ship is presumed lost." Presumed, word that breaks more than it explains. And in that single word, a captain's legacy began to dissolve. When newspapers realized the Cotopaxi was not coming back, the tone changed. The initial urgency faded. The front-page headlines vanished. Curiosity weakened. Articles became smaller. Mentions became fewer. Interests became minimal. Soon, the Cotopaxi was reduced to a footnote, lost at sea. Just 3 words crushing a lifetime. 3 words burying a captain. The silence of the press was another nail in the coffin of Meyer's memory. As decades passed, other tragedies took the spotlight: the Morro Castle, the Titanic's renewed cultural impact, World War II naval sinkings, Cold War disappearances, and the Cotopaxi had disappeared even deeper into obscurity. Historians focused on cases with surviving witnesses. Maritime institutions prioritized ships with identifiable wreckage. The world moved on. But the ocean never moved on. It kept the captain, it kept the ship, it kept the truth, hidden but not lost. In the 1940s and 50s, something fascinating happened. Writers began to explore mysterious disappearances at sea. Small magazines, cheap, sensational, sold at corner shops, published stories about ghost ships and lost crews, and the Cotopaxi, lacking facts, became a perfect target. The theories began. The ship evaporated. There was a supernatural event. The crew was abducted by forces beyond comprehension. The captain saw something he shouldn't have. All fiction, all speculation, all built on the vacuum left by silence. And the captain, who had once been a flesh and blood man, became a character. Then came the 1960s. Books about the Bermuda Triangle exploded in popularity. Radio shows, documentaries, articles, fictional reconstructions. Thousands of disappearances were attributed to the region. Many exaggerated, some invented, some distorted, and the Cotopaxi fit the mold perfectly. Old ship storm, no wreckage, no survivors, no explanations. Authors seized the story and placed it inside the triangle narrative. The captain was no longer a maritime professional. He became a ghost captain, a mysterious figure, a tragic symbol, or a victim of a paranormal phenomenon. Theories sprouted everywhere, but none of them honored the reality. It is painful to admit, but over the decades, the world cared more about the mystery than about the men who died. People asked, was it aliens? Was it a vortex? Was it a time warp? Was the captain cursed? Almost no one asked, how did those men live? How did they fight the storm? What did the captain try to do? What were those final minutes like? Mystery consumed humanity, and Meyer disappeared behind a curtain of sensationalism. For nearly a century, the captain existed only in myths, poorly written articles, exaggerated documentaries, lists of strangest disappearances, fictional retellings. He had no grave, no monument, no biography, no accurate historical record. His story floated like a ghost in the cultural imagination. Worse, his courage was forgotten, his leadership erased, his reality overshadowed by fantasy. It is here that the tragedy of memory becomes deeper than the tragedy of the sea. To be forgotten is painful, but to be distorted is cruel. Theories about the captain in the mid-20th century were outrageous. Some said he ignored warnings, others claimed he was inexperienced, others portrayed him as superstitious, some insinuated he panicked, others even suggested mutiny. None of this had any factual basis, but the public consumed these narratives eagerly. The more absurd the theory, the more attention it got. Meanwhile, the truth about Meyer, the man, the professional, the leader, remained buried under layers of imagination. For decades, the Cotopaxi remained a myth. The captain remained a mystery. The truth remained submerged. But in Part 5 and in the year 2020, everything changes. The ocean finally reveals its secret. The wreck is identified. The myth collapses. And the captain's true story begins to rise again. In the next part, the narrative shifts from speculation to revelation. The discovery of the wreck, the forensic analysis, what the remains revealed, and how the truth finally dismantled almost a century of myths. The sea kept the captain's story hidden. But it did not keep it forever. For 95 years, the SS Cotopaxi was a whisper, a shadow on maritime maps, a rumor passed between sailors, a source of speculation, superstition, and endless myth-making. For nearly a century, it existed not as a wreck but as a legend, a ghost ship swallowed by the vastness of the Atlantic, a mystery attached, unfairly, to the Bermuda Triangle, a symbol of disappearance without explanation. No survivors, no debris, no answers, but all legends have a core of truth, and in 2020, that truth finally surfaced. For decades, oceanographers, historians, and maritime enthusiasts searched for clues about the Cotopaxi storm records. Ocean current patterns, newspaper archives, old shipping routes, even testimonies from fishermen who claimed to have seen a strange silhouette adrift. Nothing was confirmed. The absence of answers allowed the mystery to grow deeper and the captain's identity to fade further into obscurity. The world built myth upon myth because silence is fertile ground for imagination. But silence is also fragile. It can be shattered by a single discovery. And in 2020 it was. In January 2020, marine archaeologists working near St. Augustine, Florida, released a public announcement. They had identified the wreck of the SS Cotopaxi. The news reverberated around the world. It was not found in the heart of the Bermuda Triangle, not near mysterious magnetic anomalies, not drifting in a supernatural fog. It lay relatively close to the Florida coastline, in a site divers had known for years under the name Bear Wreck for decades. The wreck had been misidentified, misunderstood, ignored. But now, science had spoken, and the ghost had a body again. The moment experts compared structural details, The conclusion became undeniable. This was the Cotopaxi. Painstaking analysis uncovered several truths. The ship had indeed sunk around 1925. Corrosion patterns and structural degradation matched nearly a century underwater. The cause of sinking aligned with theories of structural failure. There were no signs of explosions, fires, collisions, acts of sabotage. The whole damage was consistent with catastrophic water intrusion, exactly what researchers had long suspected. The wreck showed signs of a rapid descent. There were no indicators that lifeboats had been deployed. No evidence of organized evacuation. This supported the feared conclusion. The ship sank fast. Too fast. The structure told a story. The deformation on certain parts of the hull pointed directly to failure in the hatch areas. The very issue theorized for decades. In other words, the sea didn't hide magic. It hid a tragedy. The discovery was not just archaeological, it was cultural. It dismantled years of myths built around the Cotopaxi. Theories that had dominated books, documentaries, and sensational media crumbled. Teleportation, alien abduction, dimensional vortex, time anomalies, energy spirals, supernatural storms, government conspiracies. None of that survived the hard evidence on the ocean floor. The wreck lay exactly where a storm-driven, structurally compromised ship would realistically sink. No mystery, no magic, no triangle, just tragedy. For the first time, the world had to let go of the legend and look directly at the reality. The discovery did something extraordinary. It brought the Cotopaxi back into focus, not as a myth but as a human disaster. And with it, the captain returned to history. Newspapers didn't talk about supernatural events. They talked about the man who commanded the ship. Historians revisited archives. Families resurfaced. Researchers searched for photos, documents, anything that preserved Meyer's memory. And among those touched most deeply was Douglas Myers, the captain's grandson. Upon learning of the discovery, he expressed a sentiment that captured the emotional weight of nearly a century for the first time. "My grandfather is real again." It was a simple statement, but a powerful one. A legend cannot be honored. A man can. Archaeologists studied the wreck not as debris, but as a frozen moment in time. The collapsed hull revealed violent water intrusion, structural weakness consistent with the storm, asymmetrical deformation signs that cargo shifted dangerously, evidence the ship rolled before sinking. Every detail confirmed one narrative. The Cotopaxi was overwhelmed inside and out. The lack of lifeboat deployment indicated the crew never had a chance. This reshaped the world's understanding of the captain's final minutes. He didn't make a mistake. He didn't hesitate. He didn't cause the disaster. He faced an unwinnable battle. For decades, maritime experts had predicted the Cotopaxi's fate using weather reports, engineering knowledge, and navigational mathematics. The 2020 discovery confirmed their theories. Structural failure was the primary cause. The hatch covers could not withstand the storm. The storm accelerated the inevitable. The weather was severe, but survivable for a stronger ship. Flooding into the coal holds was deadly once water mixed with coal. Stability was lost. The sinking was fast, too fast for evacuation or organized escape. The captain fought until the final moment. The angle of the wreck suggested attempts to steer into the waves. Theories once dismissed as boring explanations turned out to be the truth. And truth, in this case, is more powerful than myth. Just as important as what the wreck confirmed is what it disproved. All the dramatic, supernatural, and sensational theories evaporated. The crew was not abducted. The ship did not disappear in calm seas. There were no mysterious radio messages. No time warp, no paranormal interference, no curse. The Cotopaxi was not a ghost ship. It was a ship that sank, in a place entirely consistent with its planned route. Reality is sometimes brutal in its simplicity. Even as myths were shattered, new emotional questions emerged. What did Meyer think in his final moments? Did he regret accepting the voyage? Did he know the ship was fatally compromised? Did he believe he could save the crew? What were his last words? Did he have a final thought of home? Questions that no wreck can answer. Questions only imagination and humanity can approach. And these questions strengthened the most compelling theory of all. Meyer died not as a mystery, but as a captain who fought until there was nothing left to fight. The discovery of the Cotopaxi reshaped the narrative. It corrected the myths, restored the history, and elevated Meyer's legacy. He was no longer the lost captain of a ghost ship, a victim of the Bermuda Triangle myth, a character twisted by sensational books. He became once again what he truly was, a leader, a professional, a sailor who faced an impossible situation. A captain who kept his post until the end. As we move into part 6, the documentary transitions into the emotional aftermath. The families, the generational pain, the psychology of loss, the restoration of the captain's memory, and how Meyer became a symbol for modern seafarers. The ghost is gone. The truth remains. And the captain finally has his story back. When the Cotopaxi vanished beneath the storm, the tragedy did not end in the sea, it began on land. Because every man aboard the ship left behind a family, a mother, a wife, a child, a friend, someone who waited, someone who refused to accept silence as an answer. And among all those families, one story stands out. The family of Captain W.J. Meyer, what the sea swallowed in hours, the family suffered for a lifetime. The first blow came in the form of telegrams, short messages, cold words, sent without emotion, without explanation, without comfort. The wives received the SS Cotopaxi as overdue and presumed lost. Mothers received no contact from ship, situation critical, and the captain's family received no updates on Captain Meyer. Await further reports, but no further reports ever came. For the families, the waiting became torture. The silence felt like a betrayal. There are stories passed down orally that many of the sailors' wives refused to believe their husbands were gone. Some kept lamps burning in windows overlooking the sea. Some walked the coastline daily, looking for debris. Some kept a packed suitcase by the bed, believing a miracle would happen. One of them was likely the captain's wife. She knew the sea could be cruel. She knew storms could destroy ships. But she also knew her husband. She believed in his skill, his discipline, his ability to survive. For months, she waited. For months, she prayed. But the sea does not return what it takes. The Cotopaxi left behind children who asked questions no adult could answer. When is my father coming home? Why didn't they find the ship? Did he leave because he wanted to? Such questions lingered not for days or months but for years. The captain's children, too, lived with this void. They grew up knowing their father vanished in the line of duty, but not knowing how, when, or why. Their lives were shaped by absence, their identity shaped by loss. Decades later, even the captain's grandson, Douglas Myers, admitted how deeply the mystery shaped the family's story. The unanswered questions carved scars into generations. The Clinchfield Navigation Company treated the tragedy as another entry in their logbook. They wrote reports, filed insurance claims, marked the Cotopaxi as lost at sea, moved on. No memorial was built, no plaque was installed, no official ceremony honored the men. 33 lives vanished, and the world simply continued. This coldness is something historians discuss to this day. Did the company know the ship was unfit for the trip? Did they ignore the captain's warnings about the hatch covers? Did their negligence contribute to the tragedy? These questions persist because the silence of corporations is deeper than the silence of the sea. In Charleston, where the Cotopaxi departed, the community was shaken. The bars went quiet. The docks felt empty. The local sailors spoke in whispers. Ships were lost every year, but losing an entire crew without a single piece of wreckage was different. It was haunting. For a long time, people avoided the topic. Not because they didn't care, but because it hurt too much to speak about. Pain unspoken does not disappear. It settles. It becomes part of the landscape. Years turned into decades. Families grew older. Children had children. New generations carried the absence without fully understanding its origin. And still, nothing was discovered. Nothing was confirmed. Nothing was explained. That is the cruelty of maritime disappearances. There is no closure, no funeral, no truth to confront. Only the horizon and the possibility of nothing. The captain's family lived with this uncertainty for nearly a century. And when the wreck was finally identified in 2020, it was as though time itself reopened wounds long scarred over. When the news broke, it was not only a historical event, it was a human event. For the families of the Cotopaxi, especially the Myers, the discovery meant something beyond archaeology. The end of the silence. For the first time, they had answers. Not all the answers. Not the emotional ones. Not the intimate ones. But enough to breathe again. One descendant said, "Now we know where he rests." A simple phrase, but it carries the weight of 95 years of grief. With the discovery came a wave of renewed interest. Historians revisited the story. Documentaries replaced myths with facts. Articles shifted focus from the Bermuda Triangle to the captain's leadership. Mariners discussed the tragedy in training programs. The captain's name returned to the surface of history for the first time in decades. Meyer was no longer treated as a ghost story. He was treated as a man, a leader, a victim of structural negligence and natural force. A captain who fought until the end. His humanity was restored. And that, for the families, was the greatest justice the ocean could offer. In maritime law, tragedies often become symbols, numbers on a list, dots on a map, references in a lecture. But the Cotopaxi was different. Its disappearance left a void so complete that theories replaced truth, and the families felt this void more intensely than anyone else. Their pain mattered because it preserved the memory, it fueled the search for answers, it kept the story alive. It demanded justice, even in silence. It rejected the supernatural explanations that overshadowed the tragedy. Pain became persistence. Persistence became truth. Truth became legacy. As the truth resurfaced and the families finally received clarity after nearly a century of silence, a new chapter began, one that was not about tragedy or mystery, but about meaning. The disappearance of the Cotopaxi had become more than a maritime loss. It had become an emblem of how easily human stories are swept aside by sensational narratives. And at the center of it all, slowly emerging from layers of myth and misunderstanding, stood Captain W.J. Meyer, no longer as a shadow, but as a figure worthy of honor. What the world began to rediscover was not just a shipwreck, but a legacy. The maritime community, historians and descendants now faced the same question. Who was the captain, truly beyond myth, beyond speculation, beyond the stories that distorted him? To answer that, researchers began examining his life through a new lens, not the lens of disappearance, but of leadership. Meyer's career, though fragmentary in records, revealed a man who had spent decades earning the trust of crews, companies, and fellow captains. He wasn't a novice thrown into a dangerous voyage. He was a seasoned professional who understood risk better than most men of his era. And this experience paints a very different picture of his final hours, not of panic, not of confusion, but of clarity, the brutal clarity that only captains facing imminent disaster ever experience. It is here that the theories shift from mystery to psychology, from supernatural speculation to human understanding. And this transition reshapes Meyer's story entirely. Leadership at sea is unlike leadership anywhere else. A captain is expected to be a strategist, a meteorologist, a mechanic, a psychologist, a navigator, and, above all, a guardian when the sea turns violent. The captain becomes the last anchor of sanity. In the case of the Cotopaxi, every credible reconstruction suggests Meyer embodied this role with unwavering discipline. Even as the storm intensified, even as water surged into the cargo hold, even as the ship listed dangerously, eyewitness traditions and maritime psychology both argue that he likely maintained composure. Not because he was fearless, but because fear is a luxury a captain cannot afford. And this composure is what is now studied, discussed, and honored. With the discovery of the wreck, naval academies began referencing the Cotopaxi tragedy in lectures on crisis leadership. It became an example not of failure, but of the impossible burden placed upon captains during emergencies. Students analyzed the structural failures, the storm intensifying the damage the moment the pumps became useless, the psychology of leading men who looked to you for survival. And the final choices Meyer may have made, what they discovered was a portrait of a man who fulfilled his duty to the last breath. A man who faced the ocean with dignity. A man who did not abandon his post. A man whose decisions, right or wrong, were driven by responsibility, not fear. The world had once reduced him to a ghost captain. Now it recognized him as a symbol of resilience. Beyond maritime academies, writers, historians, and documentary producers began shifting the narrative. No longer was the Cotopaxi used as cheap fuel for sensationalism. Instead, it became a case study in the dangers of poor ship maintenance, the vulnerability of older freighters, the consequences of ignoring safety concerns, and the tragic cost paid by those forced to sail under pressure. Meyer's earlier complaint about the deteriorated hatch covers, once a footnote in obscure logs, was reinterpreted as a warning ignored by the company. This reframing added a new layer to his legacy. He was not a negligent captain. He was a professional who tried to prevent disaster before it happened. History had wronged him. Now it was correcting itself. The most transformative part of this rediscovery, however, came from the personal stories that resurfaced. Families who had long remained silent stepped forward when the wreck was confirmed. Interviews and statements revealed pieces of Meyer's character that no document had preserved. His grandson described him as a quiet, disciplined man who believed in duty above all else. Others recalled stories told by older relative stories of a man who took pride in his work, who was respected by crews, who avoided unnecessary risk, and who understood the sea deeply. These personal recollections gave Meyer back something he had lost for nearly a century: his humanity. No longer an enigma, no longer a caricature, no longer a name tied to myth. He became real again. This shift had an immense cultural effect. People who had grown up hearing dramatic theories about the Cotopaxi now learned the truth. The ship did not vanish into a supernatural void. It broke, it flooded, it fought, and it sank. The captain did not fall victim to forces beyond science. He fell victim to a combination of flawed maintenance, harsh weather, and the unforgiving laws of physics. And in that context, his actions became even more admirable. He stood firm when the ship could no longer stand. He tried when the ship could no longer respond. He led when no path remained. He stayed in command when most men would have broken. He was, in every sense, a captain. As the maritime community embraced this new understanding, something extraordinary happened. The Cotopaxi and Meyer were no longer cautionary tales. They became inspirations. His leadership is now cited in discussions about responsibility in crisis, professionalism under extreme pressure, ethical decision-making during emergencies. The psychological burden carried by captains. In training rooms, young sailors learn that leadership is not measured by survival, but by the decisions made when survival is uncertain. Meyer's story embodies this perfectly. And yet, even as history finally restored his dignity, one haunting truth remains. No one will ever know his final thoughts. Was he thinking of his crew? Was he thinking of home? Was he blaming himself? Was he cursing the ship's structural failures? Or did he simply accept the sea's judgment with the stoicism of a man who had lived his entire life following the call of the ocean? These questions are unanswerable, but they make his story even more powerful. Because what matters most is not what he thought, but what he did. And what he did was stay. Stay until the last second. Stay when the ship became unrecognizable. Stay while the ocean rose to claim him. stay because captains do not abandon their vessels. In a world obsessed with myths, this truth shines brighter than any mystery. As the captain's legacy gradually re-emerged from beneath decades of misconceptions, researchers began to explore not only what happened to the Cotopaxi but what its story revealed about the era in which it sailed. The early 20th century was a time of transition, when maritime technology advanced faster than safety regulations. And when economic pressure often overshadowed caution, the Cotopaxi in many ways became a symbol of this imbalance. Its disappearance was not just the result of a storm, nor solely the fault of structural decay. It was part of a larger pattern, one that historians now analyze to understand how corporate decisions, economic priorities, and the harsh realities of maritime work collided to shape the captain's fate. What emerges from this analysis is a portrait not only of a ship and a captain, but of an entire system stretched to its limits. During research into Meyer's life and the Cotopaxi's final voyage, historians uncovered documents showing the pressure shipping companies placed on captains at the time. Cargo had to move even when ships weren't fully prepared. Delays were costly. Maintenance was expensive, and captains were often forced to choose between their professional judgment and their employers' expectations. This revelation reframed many assumptions about Meyer's final decision to sail, despite concerns about the hatch covers. He didn't ignore the risk, he reported it, he questioned it, but ultimately, the system he worked under left little room for objection. Understanding this reality reshaped the emotional interpretation of his last voyage. Instead of asking, why did he sail? Researchers began asking, did he really have a choice? And that question introduced a new depth to his tragedy, one tied not only to the sea, but to the world on land that shaped his decisions. As attention returned to the captain's humanity, maritime psychologists joined the discussion. They analyzed the behavior of leaders in extreme conditions and compared documented patterns with reconstructed scenarios aboard the Cotopaxi. Their findings painted a revealing picture. Leaders like Meyer, experienced, disciplined, and responsible, tend to internalize failure even when they are not at fault. This creates what psychologists call burden memory, a mental state in which captains replay decisions endlessly in their minds while the crisis unfolds. Even though it is impossible to know exactly what Meyer felt, experts believe he carried an immense weight during those final hours, not because he caused the tragedy, but because he believed it was his duty to prevent it. This psychological layer adds something powerful to the narrative. Meyer's struggle was not only against the storm, it was against himself, against the guilt he may have felt for taking the voyage, against the responsibility for the lives aboard, against the fear of making the wrong decision in a situation where every decision led to danger. This internal storm was as violent as the one outside. Meanwhile, as modern sailors learned more about the Cotopaxi, a sense of connection to the past grew among them. Maritime culture is deeply rooted in tradition, and the story of a captain who stayed at his post while his ship sank resonated strongly with crews around the world. Sailors began referencing Meyer's decisions in conversations about crisis leadership. Captains used his story to discuss the mental load of command. Some maritime academies even incorporated the Cotopaxi case into ethical training, illustrating how leaders must navigate not only storms, but the pressures of flawed systems. Through these discussions, Meyer's name transformed from a mysterious figure associated with the Bermuda Triangle into a respected example of maritime professionalism. He became a reminder of the vulnerable position captains often occupy, responsible for the safety of a ship they do not own, ordered by companies they cannot defy, and trusted by crews they cannot abandon. This recognition was perhaps the most meaningful restoration of his legacy. In parallel, oceanographers revisiting the Cotopaxi wreck produced new analyses that provided remarkable insight into the final minutes of the ship. The deformation patterns along the hull lined up with the theory that the ship flooded unevenly, causing the violent roll that doomed it. One detail surprised experts. The positioning of certain structural pieces suggested a last-moment attempt to adjust the vessel as heading. Even in the very last moments, the ship wasn't just drifting, it was being steered. This single detail, though subtle, reignited discussions about Meyer's final actions. If the ship was indeed being maneuvered until the final seconds, it meant only one thing. The captain and the remaining crew were still fighting. Not surrendering, not resigning, not paralyzed. Fighting. This detail gave life to the captain's final moments. It proved that even with the ship breaking apart, with the deck tilting, with the storm devouring everything, Meyer was still trying, still giving orders, still acting as the captain he had been all his life. It was a testament to human resilience under impossible conditions. In the midst of renewed analysis and global discussions, something else emerged, a gradual cultural shift in the way maritime tragedies are remembered. For decades, the fascination with mysterious disappearances overshadowed the human stories behind them. Ships were treated as puzzles, captains as characters, crew members as numbers. But as more tragedies from the past were reassessed with modern research, the narratives began to change. Stories like the Cotopaxi's became reminders that behind every vessel lost at sea was a community, a lineage, a circle of people whose lives were permanently altered. The The Cotopaxi's rediscovery, paired with the restoration of Mayer's humanity, contributed significantly to this shift. It encouraged historians and storytellers to prioritize people over mystery, truth over myth, legacy over spectacle. And within that movement, Mayer's story became a symbol of how history should be treated with accuracy, empathy, and respect. This cultural reevaluation inspired many to search for surviving artifacts, old photos of the crew, logs from earlier voyages, company documents, personal letters. Historians hoped to reconstruct not only the ship's fate, but the lives of the men aboard. Every small discovery contributed to a clearer picture, a crew composed of hard-working men who left home with hope, not fear, men who trusted their captain, men who believed they would return. Finding their stories reframed the tragedy. It was no longer a maritime statistic. It was a community event, a generational trauma, a wound that stretched far beyond the ocean. And once again the focus returned to the man responsible for those lives, Meyer, the captain who bore the weight of every soul on board. The recognition he never received in life now emerged through the slow, careful work of historians and descendants, determined to place his name where it belonged, not in myth, not in speculation, but in memory. As researchers, historians, and modern sailors continued to rebuild the truth around the Cotopaxi, a larger realization began to emerge, one that went far beyond the ship, the storm, or even the captain. It was the understanding that tragedies at sea do not remain in the water. They ripple outward, shaping opinions, influencing safety standards, and redefining the very way humanity understands responsibility. With Meyer's story finally restored, people began to revisit not only what happened, but what it meant. The Cotopaxi was no longer just a wreck lying on the seabed. It had become a mirror reflecting the fragility of early 20th century maritime operations and the burdens placed on those who commanded aging vessels under pressure. The deeper historians dug, the clearer it became. The captain's fate was not an isolated event, but part of a global pattern that still shapes how maritime systems operate today. As the world reassessed the Cotopaxi's legacy, maritime safety experts began citing the tragedy in discussions of structural maintenance and corporate accountability. The ship had not been lost because of supernatural phenomena or mysterious disappearances. It was lost because of circumstances that could have been prevented. The revelation was uncomfortable, but necessary. The Cotopaxi's failure was the culmination of overlooked flaws, outdated equipment, and systemic negligence. This realization turned the tragedy into a catalyst for reflection. Experts studying the case identified several lessons. Ships cannot be pushed beyond their structural limits. Maintenance cannot be delayed for financial convenience. Warnings from captains cannot be ignored. Storms are unforgiving when ships are unprepared. These conclusions form the backbone of new discussions in maritime ethics. And in these discussions, Meyer's voice, once drowned by myth, rose again with force. His earlier complaints about the hatch covers were no longer dismissed as minor concerns. They were recognized as prophetic. His insistence on caution was no longer forgotten. It became a symbol of the tension between duty and corporate expectation. His final hours spent fighting a ship that was already failing became evidence of the impossible pressures captains face when the system around them collapses. This shift transformed public perception. Where once the Cotopaxi was seen as a tragic mystery, now it was seen as a preventable disaster. And within that framing, Meyer's actions took on new clarity. He was not the captain of a ghost ship lost to an unexplained phenomenon. He was the captain of a vessel that should never have left port in its condition. He was a man who, despite knowing the risks, set sail because his position demanded it. A man who carried the burden of every soul aboard. A man whose warnings were dismissed by those above him. A man who fought until the end, even as the inevitability of the tragedy unfolded before him. This new understanding gave the story something it had lacked for almost a century: context. And context gave the captain back his dignity. As this reconstruction of meaning evolved, a broader conversation emerged in maritime circles. How many other captains throughout history had faced similar injustices? How many tragedies had been blamed on mystery when the real cause was systemic pressure or outdated infrastructure? Meyer's story became a case study illuminating this overlooked pattern. His experience was no longer unique, it was representative. By placing his tragedy within a larger historical arc, researchers realized that the Cotopaxi wasn't just a single event, it was a symbol of a turning point. The crew's sacrifice, the company's decisions, and the captain's final struggle all contributed to a deeper understanding of how maritime operations should evolve. At the same time, the emotional dimension of the story continued to expand. As families and descendants revisited the tragedy with the benefit of new knowledge, their relationship with the past shifted. Instead of mourning a mysterious disappearance, they mourned a man who had fought courageously against an impossible situation. Instead of wondering whether he had made mistakes, they recognized the difficult circumstances he had been placed in. Instead of imagining supernatural explanations, they finally had a grounded, respectful understanding of the final hours. Pain gave way to closure. Uncertainty gave way to truth. Legend gave way to humanity. And with that humanity restored, the Cotopaxi became more than a maritime tragedy. It became a story of resilience, remembrance, and respect. But perhaps the most remarkable development came from within the maritime world itself. Sailors, crew members, and captains across generations began referring to Meyer when discussing the psychological burden of command. His story aligned perfectly with what many seafarers experience even today. Captains must lead even when terrified. They must make decisions without full information. They must carry the consequences of choices they didn't want to make. They must bear the weight of every life on board, and in moments of crisis, they must stand where no one else can, between order and chaos. Meyer's story, once overshadowed by sensationalism, had become one of the most powerful examples of these truths. Sailors who read about him saw not a mythic figure, but someone like themselves, someone who lived under the same code, the same pressure, the same expectations. Through this connection, his legacy transcended history and became part of the living culture of the sea. The deeper society reflected on the tragedy, the more evident it became that Meyer's story held lessons far beyond maritime operations. It spoke to the universal struggle between duty and limitation, between responsibility and powerlessness, between human effort and the forces beyond our control. It reminded people that even in modern times, many industries still place individuals in situations where they must perform heroically simply to survive. It reminded them that leadership is not infallibility. Leadership is endurance. Leadership is sacrifice. Leadership is facing chaos with calm, not because one is fearless, but because others depend on that calm. In this way, Meyer's legacy left the ocean entirely and entered a broader conversation about leadership ethics, crisis psychology, and the human cost of organizational failure. By the time this reflection reached its modern peak, the Cotopaxi's rediscovery had left behind something far more valuable than the wreck itself: a renewed understanding of the men who sailed it and the captain who led them. For the first time in nearly a century, the story had balance. The myths had been cleared away. The facts had emerged. The captain had been restored. The families had closure. The maritime world had a teaching tool. The public had a truth more powerful than any legend. What remained was a story not of disappearance, but of remembrance, not of mystery, but of meaning, not of a ghost ship, but of a crew and a captain who faced the ocean with everything they had. And as the narrative reached its final emotional ascent, one truth stood above all. The Cotopaxi was never a story about a ship. It was a story about the people who sailed it. As the story of the Cotopaxi reached the present day, a final and essential truth emerged, one that had been buried for nearly a century. The tragedy was never just about the ship's disappearance, nor about the myths that swallowed it. It was about the people lost to the storm, the lives altered on land, and the legacy reshaped by time. And at the center of this long journey stood the man who embodied the weight of all of it: Captain W.J. Meyer. What began as a tale of mystery became a tale of humanity. And through that transformation, the world finally reclaimed what had always been his story. With the myths stripped away, the narrative illuminated the real magnitude of what the captain faced. He confronted a storm capable of tearing steel apart. He battled structural failures that had gathered over years of neglected maintenance. He carried the fear and hope of 32 men who looked to him for direction. He balanced the impossible tension between duty and survival. And he remained at his post even as the ship surrendered to the sea. His final moments, once hidden behind a century of speculation, became symbols of what it truly means to lead. For leadership is not measured by the outcome, but by the integrity of the actions taken when the outcome is uncertain. In modern naval discussions, officers often reference the Cotopaxi not as an example of mystery, but as a mirror reflecting the psychological cost of command. Meyer's final hours represent the solitude of responsibility, of solitude that only captains understand. He stood in the storm not because he believed he would win, but because others depended on him to stand. This truth, uncovered after nearly a century, resonated more deeply than any legend ever could. The supernatural narratives were exciting, but the real narrative was profound. It revealed not a ghost ship, but a ship full of people fighting until their final breath. And that reality carried far more weight than any fantasy. As the wreck was identified in 2020, and the Cotopaxi finally reclaimed from the depths of myth, the symbolism of the ship changed forever. It became not a relic of mystery, but a monument to human endurance. Each twisted beam, each rusted plate, each collapsed section told a story of effort, a story of struggle, a story of men who fought the ocean with everything they had, even when the ocean offered them nothing in return. Divers described the wreck not as eerie, but as solemn. They said it felt less like exploring a ghost ship and more like visiting a grave for 33 souls who never returned, a grave for the captain whose name was almost erased, a grave that finally received the respect it deserved. For the descendants, the wreck's discovery was a bridge between past and present. Families who had lived with unanswered questions suddenly found clarity. The captain's grandson expressed what many relatives felt: "Now we know where he rests." Those words carried an entire century of silence, grief, hope, and acceptance. The sea had not given the men back, but it had given back their story. And in doing so, it allowed generations to finally close a chapter left open since 1925. Closure does not end grief, but it transforms it. The rediscovery of the Cotopaxi also inspired a new approach to maritime storytelling. Instead of sensationalizing disappearances, historians began focusing on the real human narratives behind shipwrecks. Instead of chasing mysteries, they chased truth. Instead of feeding cultural myths, they highlighted the courage of those who faced the sea. And in that shift toward respect and authenticity, Meyer's story found its rightful place. He became more than a captain locked in myth. He became a symbol of leadership in impossible circumstances, a representative of all captains who faced overwhelming odds, a reminder that behind every tragedy is a human being who made choices, carried burdens, and fought until strength ran out. His legacy became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming force. In maritime academies, the Cotopaxi case is now discussed not as a mystery, but as a lesson in ethics, courage, and systemic failure. Students analyze Meyer's decisions, not to judge him, but to understand the weight of leadership. They evaluate the conditions he faced, the warnings he gave, and the circumstances he could not control. In these discussions, one idea is repeated more often than any other. Sometimes the greatest acts of leadership are invisible. Sometimes they happen in the final minutes, unseen by the world. Sometimes they are lost to the sea. And sometimes they resurface decades later, reminding us of the sacrifice behind every command. As the narrative reaches its final reflection, the essence of the story becomes clear. The Cotopaxi did not simply vanish, was taken by a storm and hidden by time. The Bermuda Triangle did not claim it, history did. And the captain did not become a legend. He became a memory waiting to be recovered. Today, that memory stands fully restored. Meyer's story is no longer a puzzle. It is a portrait of a man who did everything a captain could do in a situation where nothing could be done. A portrait of duty, of responsibility, of resilience, of humanity. And as long as his story continues to be told, he is not lost, not forgotten, not a myth. He is what he always was, a captain who faced the sea with honor.